The sound that woke her was the one she knew better than any human voice. 3 dots, a pause, a dash, 2 dots. Margaret Ellsworth sat up in the iron bed in the back room of the Rock River station and then did not move again for a long time. The stove had gone cold hours before. The window above the little desk held a rectangle of hard October starlight, and the frost had drawn its usual pattern of ferns and feathers across the bottom corner of the glass. She could see her own breath standing in the air above the blanket. She could see the shape of her coat hanging on the hook by the door, and she could hear, coming clean and patient through the wall from the operating room, the metallic click of a telegraph sounder that had been disconnected from its battery on the 9th of March and had not spoken one word since. She was 46 years old. She had worked that key since the spring of 1921. She had lost most of the hearing in her left ear to 28 years of leaning toward a sounder, and the men who ran the line between Cheyenne and Rawlins said she was the fastest hand on the division. And they were not being gallant when they said it. They were being accurate. She could take a message at 35 words a minute in a blizzard with the wind screaming under the door, and she could tell you who was sending it before the first sentence closed, because every operator has a hand the way every man has a walk. Some drag their dashes, some crowd their spaces, some send like they are angry at the wire. She had known operators for 20 years without once seeing their faces, and she would have recognized any of them in the dark, from 100 miles away, by rhythm alone. So when she sat up in that cold bed on the 13th of October, 1949, and heard the sounder working in the next room, the first thing she felt was not fear. It was something stranger and slower and much worse. It was recognition. Rock River sits on a flat brown table of land in Carbon County, Wyoming, where the wind has been blowing from the west since before anybody thought to write the fact down. Sagebrush, antelope, sheep in the spring, snow fence in the winter, and the Union Pacific running through the middle of it like a seam holding 2 halves of nothing together. In the good years, the town held maybe 400 people. By 1949, it held fewer, and the ones who stayed had the particular patience of people who have watched a place get smaller for 30 years and have decided not to take it personally. The station was a long, single-story building of painted board, the paint gone the color of weak coffee, with a platform on the trackside, and a water tank standing off to the north like a man waiting for a train that quit running. Inside, there was the freight room, the ticket window nobody used, the operating room with its bay window looking down the rails in both directions, and behind all of that, the back room where Meg lived. Iron bed, wood stove, a washstand, a desk with a kerosene lamp on it, and a stack of Western novels from the county circulating library, most of them read twice, some of them 3 times. A photograph of her mother in a black frame, a tin of tea. That was the whole inventory of her private life, and she would have told you it was enough, and on most days she would have meant it. She had come to Rock River at 18 because her father worked for the railroad, and her father's friend needed a relief operator, and the relief operator he needed happened to be a girl who could send cleaner than most men twice her age. She had meant to stay 2 years. She stayed 28. Somewhere in the middle of those years, the staying stopped being a decision and became a fact. The way the water tank was a fact, the way the wind was a fact. There had been a man once, in 1926, a brakeman named Ivar, who had a laugh you could hear from the freight room. He went to Nebraska for his brother's wedding and came back married to somebody else, and Meg had taken the news standing up with the key under her hand. Because the news came over the wire, and it came in his own hand, and she had recognized his rhythm 4 words before she understood what the words were saying. She had sent back the standard acknowledgement. Then she had sent congratulations. Then she had gone into the back room and stood with her forehead against the cold window for a while. And then she had come back out because the 8:40 from Laramie was running late, and somebody had to know. That was the shape of it. 28 years of other people's news passing through her fingers. Births, deaths, cattle prices, engine failures, marriage proposals, foreclosure notices, a boy in the Pacific writing his mother that he was fine, a mother in Medicine Bow writing a boy in the Pacific that his father was not. She had touched all of it and kept none of it. That is the work. You are the wire, not the message. The line died officially on the 9th of March, 1949. It had been dying for years, of course. Western Union had been closing rural offices since before the war, and the railroad had been consolidating dispatch onto the telephone circuits since about 1946. Rock River held on longer than most because of the sheep ranches, because of the distances, because there were still men in that country who trusted a wire more than a telephone and always would. But the order came down in February and the cruise came in March, and on the 9th day of that month, a young man from Laramie in a canvas coat threw the disconnect at the battery shelf and wrote something in a notebook and asked Meg if she wanted coffee. She said no. The battery jars came off the shelf in April, packed in straw inside a wooden crate, and the crate sat in the corner of the freight room from that day forward, because nobody ever came back for it. In August, a maintenance gang worked its way up the line pulling copper where the copper was worth pulling, and at Rock River they cut the leads that came in from the pole outside and left the ends hanging down the outside wall like two dead vines. Meg watched them do it from the platform with her arms folded. One of the men, an older fellow with a burned neck, said, "Ma'am, I am sorry about this." She said it was all right. He said, "No, ma'am, it is not, but thank you for saying so." The railroad kept her on, not out of sentiment or not only out of sentiment. Somebody had to hold the keys to a building the company still owned, watch for brush fires, sign for the occasional freight, and take the emergency traffic that came in over the one telephone line from the ranches when a truck went in a ditch or a woman went into labor early. She was a caretaker, with an operator's title and an operator's small salary, and she had been told twice, kindly, that the position would be reviewed in the spring. The key stayed on the operating table. Nobody told her to remove it, and she never considered it. It sat where it had sat since before she came, a Bunnell steel lever on a brass base, the black hard rubber knob worn down on the left side into a shallow dish by her own thumb and forefinger, and it gathered dust the way a chair gathers dust in a room where nobody sits. The sounder sat beside it in its resonator box, a length of pine that some operator 40 years dead had cut and nailed to make the clicks louder. Dead metal, dead wood, dead wire outside on the poles for 11 miles in either direction, hanging there because taking the wire down cost money and leaving it up cost nothing. For 7 months, the operating room had been the quietest place Meg had ever stood in. She had not expected the silence to be so physical. She kept walking into it and stopping, the way you stop in a doorway when you have forgotten what you came for. She got in the habit of sitting at the table in the evening with her hand flat on the wood, not touching the key, just sitting there while the light went out of the bay window, and she never told anyone about that habit, because there was no way to say it that did not sound like the beginning of something people would want to discuss with her. Then came the 13th of October. 3 dots, a pause, a dash, 2 dots. She got out of bed. The floor was cold enough through her wool socks to make her toes curl. She took the matches from the shelf and lit the lamp, and she noticed with a kind of clinical interest that her hands were steady, which surprised her, and which she would think about later. The room came up yellow around her. Her breath went across the light in a slow cloud. The sound did not stop while she stood there. It went on in the next room, unhurried, spacing itself out the way a sender does when he knows the man on the other end is not at the table and wants to be sure the call is still going when he comes back. ... Pause, dash, ... Again, again. It is a call. It is a station, calling a station. She carried the lamp into the corridor. 6 steps. She had walked those 6 steps at every hour of the day and night for 28 years, and she had never once walked them slowly. The door to the operating room stood half open the way she had left it. She pushed it with the back of her wrist, and the hinges made the same complaint they always made, and she stopped in the doorway with the lamp held out in front of her at the height of her shoulder. The sounder was working. The armature was rising and falling in its box. She could see it move. That is the thing she would come back to over and over in the weeks that followed. Standing in a doorway in the middle of the night, looking at a small piece of iron going up and down in a pine box that no current on earth was reaching. Up, down, with a rhythm so human that she found herself, without deciding to, reading it before she thought to be afraid of it. She set the lamp on the table. The light slid across the brass and the dust. The battery shelf was empty. She looked at it anyway. She walked around the table and looked at the two lead wires where they came through the wall by the window, and they ended in the air a foot short of anything, the copper gone dull and green at the tips, exactly as the gang had left them in August. She put her fingers on the cut ends, cold. She looked at the ground wire, disconnected in March, coiled on a nail. She looked at the resonator box and at the small dark gap under the armature, and at nothing at all that could explain the sound that was still going on 8 inches from her face. ... Pause, dash, ... 28 years of training does a thing to a person that the person does not get to vote on. Meg sat down in the operator's chair, and she pulled the notebook across the table toward her. She took the pencil out of the groove where the pencil always was, and she began to write. The call ran a while longer, and then the sender opened up. It began, as every message begins, with the identification of the station sending it. RLV. She wrote the letters, and then she looked at them. Rollinsville had been a wayside office on a spur north of the main line, 3 rooms and a coal stove, and it had been closed in 1931 and torn down for its lumber in 1933. Meg had never been inside it. She had worked it 100 times. There had been a man there named Sorensen, who sent with a heavy fist, and a woman named Alma Pike, who sent like she was in a hurry to get home. And after Alma, the office had been staffed by whoever the company could spare, and then it had not been staffed at all, and then it had not been there. The letters kept coming, she kept writing. That is the discipline. You do not read while you receive. You take it down and you read it after, because the moment you start understanding words, you fall behind them. 28 words came through, and then the sender closed and the room went quiet. Meg sat with the pencil in her hand. Her ears were ringing the way they always did after a long take, the good ear worse than the bad one, and the lamp was making its small noise, and out on the flat somewhere, a dog was barking at something or at nothing. She read what she had written. She had known before she read it. That was the part she could not get around afterward, no matter how many nights she went over it. She had known while she was taking it down, in the way that you know a footstep in a hallway belongs to somebody in your family. The hand was familiar. The hand was more than familiar. The dashes came a little long. There was a hitch in front of every letter H, a hesitation of maybe 1/5 of a second, the kind of thing an ear only catches after years, and it was there because the index finger that made it had been broken in 1924, when a stock car door came down on it and had healed slightly stiff at the middle joint. It was her hand. It was her own sending, note for note, the way a man might hear his own laugh come out of another room. And the words were hers. She had transmitted them on the 19th of February, 1929. She could have told you that date before she looked at the message, and she did not have to look anything up, and there was nothing written anywhere in that building to check it against, because the message logs from the 20s had gone to Omaha in 1940 and had probably been burned for space by then. The message was to a rancher named Emmett Doyle, whose place was 14 miles northwest on the Medicine Bow Road. It said that the medical supplies he had wired for had been put on the 1140 out of Laramie and would be at Rock River Station by 2 in the afternoon, and that the pharmacist was sending the second item at no charge. 28 words. A perfectly ordinary message. The most ordinary kind of message there is. Meg remembered sending it because Emmett Doyle's wife had died 4 days earlier, on the 15th of February, in a bedroom 14 miles from any doctor, with the child alive and the mother gone. And because the supplies he had wired for were for the baby, and because the second item the pharmacist was sending at no charge was a nursing bottle, and because when Meg's fingers closed on the key to send the words at no charge, she had started to cry, sitting up straight in that chair, still sending clean, tears going down her face, and her hand never faltering once. She had been 26 years old. It was the first time she had ever cried at the key. It was not the last, but a person remembers the first. Nobody in the world knew that. Doyle did not know it. He had come in at 2:30, put the box under his arm, thanked her, touched his hat, and driven back out the Medicine Bow Road. And he had died himself in 1944 of a thing in his stomach, and the child had grown up and married a man in Rawlins and moved to Oregon. Nobody knew. There was no record. There was no witness. There was only a woman in a cold room in the middle of the night, with 28 words on a page in her own handwriting, sent to her by a station that had been kindling for 16 years, in a hand she had spent her whole life listening to from the inside. She did not go back to bed. She sat in the operator's chair until the window went from black to grey to the particular thin blue that comes before sunrise on the high plains in October, and the room got colder before it got warmer the way rooms do. And at some point she became aware that her feet had gone numb and that she had been sitting with her right hand resting on the table 2 inches from the key without touching it. When the light was good enough, she went outside without her coat. The pole stood 40 feet from the north wall of the station. It was a cedar pole set in 1898, grey as bone, with the old cross arms still on it and 6 glass insulators still in place. 2 of them cracked. The wires ran off it to the east and to the west and disappeared into the distance in both directions, along the right-of-way, sagging and rising, the way they had her whole life. Frost on them. A magpie sitting on the westbound wire about 100 yards off, and the wire not moving at all under its weight because the wire was slack and old and going nowhere. She followed the drop from the crossarm down the side of the pole to the point where the maintenance gang had cut it in August. 2 feet of wire hanging free. The cut was clean. She had watched the man make it. She stood there in her nightgown and her coat sweater and her boots with the laces not tied. A woman of 46 with grey coming in at the temples, looking up at a pole in the cold, and she said out loud, "To nobody." Well, that was the whole of her reaction, and it took about 10 minutes. Then she went in and lit the stove and made tea and got dressed and did the day's work, which consisted of sweeping the platform, walking the switch to see whether anybody had thrown it, taking down the number of a westbound freight for the book, and eating a piece of bread with jam standing at the counter. She washed the cup. She put it back on the shelf. The notebook stayed on the operating table where she had left it. She did not look at it again until dark, and when she did, the words had not changed, and the handwriting was still her own. On the second night, nothing happened. She lay awake for most of it in a state she could not put a name to, listening to the building tick as the temperature dropped, hearing 100 sounds that were not the sounder, and around 3 she got up and went into the operating room and stood there in the dark for a while, and then went back to bed, feeling like a fool. She told herself, in the voice she used for hired men who had lost a tally sheet, that she had dreamed it, and she told herself that the writing in the notebook proved nothing except that a woman who lives alone can do strange things in her sleep, and both of those explanations were available to her, and neither one of them survived the third night. The third night was the 15th of October. It began at 12 minutes past 1. She was awake. She had been awake, or half awake, in that shallow water where you can still hear the room. The call came through the wall and she was on her feet before she knew she had decided anything, and she brought the lamp and she sat down in the chair, and this time she did not waste any of it looking at the battery shelf. The station code came first, MOW Medicine Bow, 22 miles up the line. That office had been closed in 1938 and the building was still standing, but it had a hardware business in it now. Then the message, 16 words. A notice to the section foreman at Rock River that a work extra would be arriving at 4 in the afternoon and required a man to line the siding. Meg had sent that message on the 3rd of June, 1934. She wrote it down, and she read it, and she sat back in the chair with the pencil across her knuckles, and this time she noticed something she had missed before because she had been too far inside the first shock to look for it. The sending was not just her hand. It was her hand at 29. She sent differently now, every operator does. You get faster in your 20s and cleaner in your 30s, and by your 40s you develop small economies, a shorter interval before a numeral, a way of running certain letter pairs together that a younger operator has not learned yet. The sending coming out of that dead sounder had the openness of her early work. It was the hand she had had in 1934, and it was not the hand she had now. She could not have explained to a living soul how she knew that. She would not have tried. It was the kind of knowledge you cannot get to the outside of, like knowing your own face is your own face. The sounder went quiet at 25 past 1. She stayed at the table until 4. After that, it came almost every night. never before midnight, usually between 1 and 3. Once, on the 21st at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning, and that was the only time it ever ran 2 messages back to back. And every night it opened with the call letters of an office that was not there anymore. Como, which had been a helper station in the days of the old grade, and had gone out of service in 1929. Lookout, which had never been more than a shack and a siding, and had burned in 1935. Aurora, which had closed the year the war started, and where a man named Halverson had once held a wire open for 40 minutes in a snowstorm so that a doctor in Rawlins could talk a rancher's wife through a breech berth on the other end of a telephone patch. And Meg had sat in the middle of that circuit for the whole 40 minutes with her hand on the key, relaying, and the child had lived, and the child had been named Halver, and she had never met him. Dead offices. All of them. Not one of those buildings had a wire in it, or a man in it, or a floor in it in some cases, and the calls came in from them one after another, as if the line between Cheyenne and Rawlins had gone back 40 years overnight, and every little wayside had lit up again in the dark. And every message was hers. That was the pattern, and the pattern never broke, and after the 5th night she stopped waiting for it to break. The 19th of October brought a distress call from the summer of 1931, a message she had sent on behalf of a sheepman named Ruiz, whose herder had not come down off the freeze-out mountains for 11 days, and who wanted the sheriff notified, and wanted it notified now. She had sent it at 7 in the morning, and she had sent it 3 times to 3 different addresses. They found the herder on the 4th day, alive, with a broken ankle and a dog that had stayed. The 20th brought a death notice from 1936. A woman named Cora Ekstrom, age 71, of the town of Rock River, to be conveyed to her son in Illinois. Meg had known Cora Ekstrom. Cora Ekstrom used to bring her rhubarb. The 21st brought 2. The first was a routine consist report from 1941. The second was a birthday telegram from the 8th of May, 1942, from a mother in this town to a boy at a training camp in Texas. 12 words, ending with the words, "We are all fine here, do not worry about us." The boy's name was Delbert Hoyer, and he had been 19 years old, and he had been dead in the Solomon Islands by the following November, and his mother had been in that station 4 times in 1942, and never once after, and Meg had carried the second telegram out to the Hoyer place herself in December, because she did not want it to arrive by a stranger's hand. She took that one down at 10 minutes past 4 in the morning with the lamp guttering, and she got to the end of it, and she put the pencil down, and she put both hands flat on the operating table, and she stayed that way for a while. You have to understand what was happening to her, and it was not what a stranger would assume. She was not being haunted in the way people mean that word. Nothing came into the room. Nothing moved except one small piece of iron in a pine box. There was no cold spot, no voice, no shape at the window, no dread. If anything, the opposite. The nights had a quality she would have called companionable if the word had not been so ridiculous applied to a machine with no current in it. The sending was patient. It waited between messages the way an operator waits for the other man to catch up. It never repeated itself unless she missed a word. And when she missed a word, it repeated. It never came before midnight, when she might have been standing right there. It came when she was in bed, and it called until she got up, and it did not begin until she was in the chair with the pencil in her hand. She was being sent to, and what she was being sent was her own life, out of order, 28 years of it, one night at a time. She kept the notebook open beside the bed after the first week. Then she got a second notebook out of the supply cupboard, and then a third, and she stopped bothering to put them away. And by the end of the month, there was a stack of them on the corner of the operating table, all of them in the same handwriting, all of them dated at the top in the same handwriting, all of them full of messages that had been transmitted between 1922 and 1947, and had been gone from the world since the moment the current stopped. She began to sleep in the afternoons. She did not think of this as a decline, and it would be dishonest to describe it as one. She thought of it as a schedule, the way any night operator learns to think about the shape of the day. She swept the platform in the morning. She walked the length of the yard. She ate at noon. She slept from 1 o'clock until 5:30. She read her westerns until 9. She went to bed at 10 and lay listening. There was 1 week in there, the week of the 24th, when the electric bulb over the freight room door burned out and she did not replace it, and she noticed on the Friday that she had not spoken out loud to another human being since the previous Sunday, and that the last thing she had said had been thank you to a truck driver about a package. She did try once to tell somebody. His name was Roy Ferris, and he was the section foreman, 61 years old, a widower, thick in the shoulders, missing the top of one ear from a thing that had happened in a roundhouse in 1912. He and Meg had worked the same 11 miles of railroad for 22 years. On the 23rd of October, he came by the station to store 2 kegs of spikes out of the weather, and while he was stacking them in the freight room, Meg stood in the doorway with her arms folded and heard herself say, "Roy, does that sounder ever run when you are in here?" He straightened up. He said, "Run." She said, "Click. Does it ever click?" He looked at her for a second longer than the question needed. Then he took his cap off and scratched the back of his head and put it on again, and he said, "Meg, that thing has not had a volt through it since March." Then he said, "And neither have I," and he laughed at his own joke, and she laughed too, because that was the exit and she took it. He went back to the spikes, but at the door on his way out, he stopped with his hand on the frame and said, without turning around, "You doing all right out here by yourself?" She said yes. He said, "My wife used to hear the milk cans 2 years after we sold the cows, middle of the night, clear as anything, out in the yard." Meg said, "What did you tell her?" He said, "I told her I heard them too." Then he said goodnight and went out across the tracks to his truck, and Meg stood in the freight room in the dark, listening to the engine turn over and pull away west, and she understood that she had just been given a kindness, and that she was never going to tell him or anybody else anything more about it. That was the 23rd. She wrote down nothing about the conversation. It is not in the notebooks. There is no record of it anywhere except that Roy Ferris told a version of it to a claims agent in December, and the claims agent wrote 3 lines about it, and the 3 lines went in a folder. What is in the notebooks on the night of the 23rd is a message from Lookout, sent at 1:50 in the morning, being a request from the agent at Walcott for a wrecking crew and 2 flat cars following a derailment of 4 cars of coal at the East Switch, original transmission, the 4th of January 1930. She had been 27. It had been 11 below zero. She had worked that circuit for 9 hours without leaving the chair, and somebody had brought her soup, and she had drunk it left-handed. There is a thing about the work that Meg had never had occasion to explain to anybody, because the only people who would have understood it were other operators, and other operators did not need it explained. The wire is not a telephone. On a telephone, you hear a person. On a wire, you hear a hand, and a hand is closer to a person than a voice is, because a voice can be put on and a hand cannot. In 28 years, she had listened to men break down on the key. She had heard a dispatcher in Rawlins get slower and slower over the course of a night in 1943, and had known an hour before the message came that something had happened to his son. She had heard a young operator at Hannah get faster and sloppier and sharper across 3 weeks, and had known he was drinking again before his own foreman did. She had heard men flirt on the key and prey on it and lie on it badly, and once, in 1937, she had heard a man in Cheyenne send a completely routine string of freight numbers in a rhythm so broken and strange that she had held the circuit and asked him, informally, off the record in the little shorthand operators use with each other, whether he was all right, and he had sent back the 2 letters that mean yes, and 40 minutes later he had shot himself in the relay room. You are the wire, not the message. That is what they tell you. But nobody is the wire. Everybody who ever sat down at a key put their whole self into the way they made the letters, and every single message that ever crossed that division had 2 things in it: the words which belonged to the sender, and the hand, which belonged to the operator. And the hand is the part that nobody was ever paying for and nobody ever kept. Meg had put her hand on 28 years of other people's news: weddings, indictments, bank failures, hay prices, a man asking his brother for money in 1932 in the politest language she had ever seen anybody use, a girl in 1928 arranging to meet a boy at the Laramie Depot without her father knowing, and Meg had sent it and never said a word about it for 21 years. She had been the most reliable secret keeper in Carbon County by virtue of a job that gave her no choice. And now, at 46, in a building the company had already decided to write off, In a room with a dead wire and a cold stove, somebody was sending it all back to her, not the words. The words were nothing. Consist reports, supply orders, birthday greetings, notices of death. The hand. Her hand. Every hesitation before an H. Every long dash. All of it, preserved somewhere she could not point to, and coming back down a line that 11 men had personally disconnected. She started to be able to date the messages by the sending before she read the words. 1924 had a stiffness in it because of the finger. 1931 was the fastest she ever was. 1940 had a flatness she did not like hearing and did not remember feeling. By the 26th of October there were 200 and some pages. She was not afraid. She wants that understood, or she would have, if anybody had ever asked her, and nobody ever did. What she felt in those last 2 weeks was closer to what a person feels turning the pages of a photograph album that somebody else assembled without telling them, and finding that whoever assembled it had gotten every single date right. The weather turned on the 27th. It came in the way it does in that country, without much warning and without much drama. The sky going the color of an old nickel by 2 in the afternoon, and the wind swinging around to the north, and the temperature falling 19 degrees between 3 and 6 o'clock. It did not snow that night. It only got cold and stayed cold, and everything in the station that could contract contracted, so that the walls popped and the roof timbers cracked, and the stovepipe made a noise like a man clearing his throat every 20 minutes. Meg brought in more wood than she needed. She banked the stove. She put the second blanket on the bed and she put her coat on top of the second blanket, and at 11 o'clock she lay down in the dark and listened to a building talking to itself in the cold. And she found, and this is the part she would not have been able to justify, that she was waiting the way a person waits for a letter. It came at 40 minutes past midnight. Aurora. 16 words. A message she had sent on the 2nd of October, 1939, to the effect that the westbound local was annulled and that the mail would be trucked. The 28th brought Como at 10 past 2, 31 words, a message from 1926 regarding a shipment of range fence and a request for the return of 2 empty gondolas, sent on a July afternoon so hot that she had worked in her stocking feet with the door propped open and a wet cloth on the back of her neck. The 29th was a Saturday. She spent the day the way she spent all of them by then. She swept a platform that no passenger had stood on since 1947. She walked to the switch and back. At noon she ate the last of a loaf and made a note on the pad by the door to have the store send another, and she looked at that note for a moment and then added, in the same hand she had used for 28 years, and matches. She slept in the afternoon and dreamed nothing she could remember. At 6 in the evening she stood at the bay window in the operating room and watched the last of the light go off the freeze-outs to the northwest. That particular late October light that lies along the top of a range for 4 or 5 minutes and then leaves all at once. And she thought about how many times she had watched exactly that, from exactly that window, with a message half taken and a pencil in her hand and the whole thing going on behind her while the light went. She read for a while. She could not have told you what. She went to bed at 10. The call came at 3 minutes past 3 on the morning of the 30th of October, 1949. She was awake for it. She got up and lit the lamp and walked the 6 steps and sat down and pulled the notebook over, page 340-something. The pencil was down to about 4 inches by then, and she had sharpened it with a paring knife. There was no station code. That was the first thing. 22 nights, 26 messages, and every one of them had opened with the call letters of an office that no longer existed, and this one did not. It opened with the 2 letters that mean the sender has traffic and is ready, and then it went straight into the body, without identifying itself at all. The second thing was the hand. It was hers, and it was not her hand at 26 or 29 or 31. It was her hand now. The economies were in it. The short interval before a numeral. The stiffness in the finger, which had gotten worse with the cold in the last 2 winters, showing up not just before the letter H, but in front of anything that required the finger to come up quickly. It was the sending she would have produced that night if she had put her thumb and forefinger on the knob and worked the lever herself. She took it down without stopping. That is the discipline. The message read that Rock River Station was calling all offices on the line, that the operator, Margaret Ellsworth, was closing her transmission at 17 minutes past 3 in the morning on the 30th day of October, 1949, that she thanked her colleagues of 4 decades, and that winter had come early this year. 39 words. The sounder stopped. She read it twice. Then she looked up at the wall above the ticket window where the station clock hung. A Seth Thomas in an oak case that had been on that wall since the building went up, and that she had wound every Sunday morning of her adult life, and the hands stood at 8 minutes past 3. 9 minutes. There is no way to know what she thought during those 9 minutes, and it would be an insult to invent it. What can be said is what was in the room. A lamp with maybe an hour of kerosene in it. A stove going in the next room, banked, doing very little. A window with frost on the inside of the glass and the outside temperature standing at 4 above 0 with a north wind. A stack of notebooks on the corner of the table, 346 pages filled, a stub of pencil, a woman of 46 in a nightgown and a coat sweater, and her boots pulled on unlaced, sitting in a chair with a curved back that had been sat in by 6 operators before her, in a building on a plain in Wyoming, 11 miles from the nearest lit window. And in front of her, under the lamp, a steel lever on a brass base with the black knob worn down on the left side into a shallow dish by her own hand, and the 2 cut wires hanging dead outside the wall behind her head, and 11 miles of wire on either side going out into the dark toward Medicine Bow, and toward Wilcox, and toward every office where somebody used to be. The clock ticked. At some point in those 9 minutes, she put her finger on the key. The record of that is physical, and it is not in dispute. What is in dispute, or rather what nobody has ever been able to say, is what she meant by it. Because there are 2 things an operator does with a finger on the lever. She answers or she sends. Acknowledging a message and originating one, use the same hand, the same lever, the same small pressure of the same worn joint, and from the outside, from a distance of 70-odd years and a coroner's form, there is no way on earth to tell which one a woman was about to do. The clock came around to 17 minutes past 3. The wind was out of the north at about 25 miles an hour that morning, and it stayed that way until after sunrise. There was no snow at Rock River that night, though there were 4 inches at Elk Mountain by noon. The section crew did not work that Sunday. The westbound freight went through at 4:20, and the head brakeman, a young man named Cyrus Vantassel, said later that he had looked over at the station as they came past, the way you do, and had seen a light on in the bay window, and had thought nothing of it whatsoever because there had been a light on in that window at 4 in the morning for as long as he had been running that district. Margaret Ellsworth was found on the 22nd of November, 1949. The delay is not as strange as it sounds, and it is worth understanding, because it is the part that people get wrong. The station had no telephone service after the 18th of October, when a pole came down 8 miles east, and the company decided to splice it in the spring. Her pay came by mail on the 1st of the month, and the mail went into a box, and the box did not care. She had no family living, she was not expected anywhere. Roy Ferris was in Idaho with his daughter from the 4th of November. The store in town had a standing order to send bread and matches out with anybody heading that way, and the boy who usually took it had gone to work at a filling station in Laramie, and the woman who ran the store meant to ask about it, and did not, and thought about it twice and was sick about it for the rest of her life. It was a stock inspector named Whitcomb who went in on a Tuesday, looking for a signature on a shipping form. She was in the operator's chair. She was sitting upright. The lamp had burned dry and gone out weeks before. The stove was cold, and there was still wood in it that had never caught. The room was 13 degrees and had been below freezing more or less continuously since the end of October, which is why there was nothing about the condition of the body that made the inspector do anything other than take his hat off and back out and drive 19 miles to find a telephone. Her right hand was on the key, not near it, on it, the index finger resting on the knob, the thumb underneath, in the position that anybody who has ever worked a straight key would recognize instantly, and that no person arranges by accident, and that a body does not fall into. The county coroner for Carbon County examined her on the 23rd. His finding was cardiac arrest. His estimate of the time of death, based on the condition of the remains and the temperature of the building and the state of the stove and the lamp, was the early morning hours of the 30th of October, give or take 1 day. He wrote that estimate on the form and initialed it, and never revised it. And when a claims agent asked him in December how firm he considered it, he said it was as firm as anything gets under those conditions. And then he said, "And I do not know how she came to be sitting up." Beside her on the operating table were 4 notebooks. 347 pages had been written in. Every page was dated at the top. The dates ran from the 13th of October to the 30th of October, 1949, consecutively, with only the 2 nights missing that Meg had noted at the time as nights when nothing came. Every page was filled with messages transcribed from Morse into plain English in a small, fast, slightly forward-leaning hand. The handwriting of somebody trained to write at speed with the ear doing one job and the fingers doing another. The handwriting was hers. There was never any question about it. The claims agent compared it against 19 years of train registers, message logs, requisition forms, and monthly reports in the Laramie office, and wrote in his summary that no difference could be identified. The messages were checked, or some of them were. Not many, because there was no reason to and nobody was paying for it. But a clerk in Omaha with an interest in the thing pulled 4 of them out of the surviving division files in 1950 and found all 4. A supply notice from February of 1929, a wrecking request from January of 1930, a death notice from 1936, an annulment notice from October of 1939, word for word, including the addresses, including, in one case, a spelling error in a proper name that appeared in the original transmission and in the notebook and nowhere else. The last page has 1 message on it. It has no station code. It is 39 words long. It says that Rock River Station is calling all offices, that the operator Margaret Ellsworth closes her transmission at 17 minutes past 3 in the morning on the 30th day of October, 1949, that she thanks her colleagues of 4 decades, and that winter has come early this year. Below the last word, there is a mark where the pencil was set down, and then picked up again, and then set down. The file was closed in March of 1950. There was no criminal question, and no insurance question of any size, and the railroad's interest in the matter was limited to the disposition of the building and the final settlement of a small pension, and the notebooks went into a box, and the box went to Omaha, and the box has not been located since 1961. The battery jars were still in the crate in the freight room, packed in straw, where they had been since April. The lead wires from the pole were still cut, 2 feet of them hanging down the outside of the north wall, dull green at the ends. A photograph of the north elevation of the station, taken by a company surveyor in 1951, shows them clearly, hanging exactly where the August gang left them, which is why we know. The Rock River Station was demolished in the spring of 1953. The lumber went to a sheep operation south of town, and some of it is presumably still in a barn out there holding up a roof. The water tank came down the following year. The Seth Thomas clock was taken by somebody, and nobody knows by whom. The key went missing at the same time or before, and there is a man in Rawlins who claims his grandfather had it, and there is no reason to believe him, and no reason not to. The poles are still standing. Not all of them. Most of them. They run along the old right-of-way east and west out of Rock River, grey cedar going soft at the base, crossarms tilted, glass insulators cracked or shot out or still catching the light in the late afternoon, and on a good many of them the wire is still up. Nobody has taken it down because nobody has ever had a reason to spend money taking it down. It sags between poles across 11 miles of sagebrush, running from a place where a building used to be to a place where another building used to be, and it has not carried a current since the 9th of March, 1949. It has not carried a current since then. That is the one thing everybody involved agreed on. The gang that cut it agreed. The company that owned it agreed. The coroner did not have an opinion and did not need one. The claims agent wrote a single sentence about it, and the sentence reads that no electrical explanation was sought as none was required. None was required. The line was dead. And for 18 nights in October of 1949, in a cold room at the end of a corridor 6 steps long, It spoke to a woman who had given it 28 years in her own hand, in her own rhythm, with a hesitation before every letter H, and it gave her back every word she had ever sent for somebody else. She wrote all of it down. She thanked her colleagues. She mentioned that winter had come early, and then, at 17 minutes past 3 on the 30th of October, with her finger on the lever, she either answered the line or she opened it, and there is nobody left who can tell us which.